Hi everyone, welcome back. It's been a long time since you've seen my face. I originally started this channel for my very long Brandon Sanderson book reviews, and then it's sort of since then become a place for a lot of song edits and animatics and things like that, and this is sort of where those worlds collide, because today I am making my very first video essay on, queerness in kids' cartoons. So, something that you should maybe know about me is that I am notoriously late to every party. I grew up watching animated movies on DVD on a box TV in my basement. So that was my experience with animation, and I have now seen a whopping 5.5 cartoons, and they were all in the past year and a half. So I first watched Gravity Falls and The Owl House at age 21. Another thing you should know about me is that when I like something, it tends to become my personality for the next 6 months. You might be able to tell by the other things on my channel, but after watching these two kids' shows for the first time at age 21, I proceeded to spend hours going down rabbit holes on YouTube and Reddit about all of the lore and the codes and making art and making animatics and listening to video essays and all of that. So that's how we got here. Rookie mistake, I did watch The Owl House before I watched Gravity Falls. So while I was watching Gravity Falls, and especially towards the end of Gravity Falls, I started noticing a lot of interesting similarities and interesting comparisons that you can draw between Gravity Falls and The Owl House that I want to explore today. Those of you who are not familiar with the shows, I will probably kick you out because of spoilers in a couple minutes, but basically Gravity Falls and The Owl House are two kind of similar shows with a lot of personnel overlap. They're both Disney Channel / Disney Plus shows, and they're commonly regarded as sister shows along with Amphibia, which I have not seen, but I've also heard is very good. They both follow young main characters who are thrown into an unfamiliar world full of magic and weirdness, and they're sort of forced to confront their relationships to their real and found families, their first experiences with romance, the horrors of growing up, and sort of where they fit in this wild, rapidly changing world. The big difference is that these shows came out in wildly different political and social contexts. Gravity Falls came out in 2012, and The Owl House came out in 2020. And it's really fascinating to look at them sort of in conversation with each other. So that's kind of what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about how these two shows handle weirdness in relation to queerness, and specifically how The Owl House sort of builds on ideas that Gravity Falls introduced, and in some ways picks up where Gravity Falls left off. I want to make it really clear here that I am not intending to accuse any specific person of homophobia. This comparison is meant to sort of show the difference in societal perception and the Disney censorship rules between the 2010s and the 2020s. It is not meant to say Gravity Falls is homophobic. That is not what we're saying here. The only entities that might incur any kind of blame here are the Disney company itself or the Standards and Practices Department of Disney at the time. So the big thing that got me thinking about this was that while I was watching Gravity Falls, having already watched The Owl House, we got to Weirdmageddon, and there's a specific scene, like a calm little scene of a squirrel walking across the street or whatever, and then a mailbox comes to life and snaps it up and eats it. And I looked at that and I was like, that is so unbelievably Boiling Isles coded, and I know that that came first. But it got me thinking that Weirdmageddon is sort of a typical Tuesday on the Boiling Isles. Like, on the Boiling Isles, you have that moment all the time where it's like, this street lamp is kind of an octopus, and this school locker will fight you for your lunch. Everything is alive and kind of creepy and weird. So it got me thinking about sort of weirdness as a concept and how it is handled in Gravity Falls and how it's handled in The Owl House. There's another moment that got me thinking about sort of The Owl House as a kind of a continuation of the subject matter of Gravity Falls, and this came to me while I was listening to the video essay by Haley Whipjack that is did Mabel cause Weirdmageddon. Haley basically says in there that Mabel is faced with this choice when she gives the rift to Blendon that ends up beginning Weirdmageddon. That's not the decision that she's making. The decision that she's been offered is, do I go back to the real world and grow up, or do I stay in this safe fantasy world? When I was listening to that essay, I realized that decision that Mabel faces at the beginning of Weirdmageddon, that's where loses at the very beginning of the series, or at the end of the first episode when she decides that she's not going to go to summer camp and she's going to instead stay with Eda and King. And then she proceeds to stay there for the entirety of season 1, to the point where in Grom, her worst fear is having to leave that escapism fantasy. So now we get to the concept of weirdness. And this is something that permeates both shows, especially Gravity Falls. But I was curious, and I ended up searching all of the episodes of both shows for the word weird, and I didn't include all of the occurrences, but I found that, in general, Gravity Falls uses the word weird or weirdness negatively much more than the Owl House does. And you can already see that the concept of weirdness is generally more positive in the context of the Owl House than it is in Gravity Falls. That has been reclaimed to an extent in the Gravity Falls books, but a lot of these conversations are going to be based on what is presented in the show because the books are more recent and less Disney censored. So in the original shows, weirdness is seen as much more negative in Gravity Falls. There's a little bit more background information that I want to introduce before I dive into the specifics of both shows. I am going to bring up another video essay that I watched by Hannah Hyperfixates, which is a fascinating video if you ever want to spend 2 hours talking about queerness in Gravity Falls. It is a great video. Hannah introduces the Hays Code, which is a set of industry guidelines for television that was in effect from about the 1930s to the 1960s. Basically, the goal was to make it so that television wouldn't be corrupting people's minds, and it would all be in line with, Christianity and Christian ideals. This is a really interesting line from the Hays Code. It says, "The sympathy of the audience shall never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin." And in the 1930s, you can take sin a lot of different directions. So if you wanted to show any sort of these, negative traits from the perspective of society, it has to be attributed to a villain, and then the villain has to be defeated by the end of the story. And so this carries into a lot of villain stereotypes that still persist today, who are kind of queer-coded. If they're a woman, then they might have short hair, and they might be very independent and very kind of strong and kind of masculine or butch. And that also plays into a lot of kind of witch stereotypes, which I'll get into a little bit later. If they're men, they are very charismatic, they're very fashionable, they might have high voices or expressive body language and be very flirtatious and very physical and very kind of flamboyant. And I can't think of any examples off the top of my head right now, but you understand what I'm saying. So a lot of these sort of stereotypical villain traits are not necessarily being added in order to make you think that the character is queer. Hannah Hyperfixates says, "The writing team of Gravity Falls likely wasn't trying to make Bill come off as gay, but rather for him to come off as villainous using the visual shorthand that's been available to writers and audiences since the 1930s. So this is a precedent that's just being followed. It's not something that Gravity Falls specifically does. It's something that Disney has been doing for a long, long time. So with that sort of basis, we are going to dive into each of the shows and talk about specifically how each of them handles weirdness and queerness. So let's get started. let's talk about Gravity Falls. Those of you who are trying to avoid spoilers have probably already left, or should have by now, but Gravity Falls was created by Alex Hirsch, and it aired between 2012 and 2016 on Disney Channel. The premise is that 12-year-old twins Dipper and Mabel are staying with their grunkle Stan in Gravity Falls, Oregon, a town that attracts various types of weirdness to it. Once again, most of the evidence that I am discussing today comes from the show and not the companion books, although I will be referring to them sometimes. Dipper is kind of the main character of Gravity Falls. He's 12, he is very nerdy, fascinated by all things weirdness and supernatural. He's very anxious. He is often headcanoned in the fandom as transmasc because he struggles with and confronts insecurity about masculinity in a lot of different contexts, and that's a great thing for cis boys to see in general, to be like, wow, actually it's okay to like things that are girly, and it can still make you masculine and make you a man. But for Dipper, it goes a little bit beyond that. You see him struggling with voice insecurity and height insecurity and being in a girl's body and freaking out. And so there's a lot of basis for that. And then in Journal 3, you also get a scene where Dipper sort of nervously confides in Ford that Dipper isn't his real name and tells him his real name. And it is a wildly transcoded scene. So that's Dipper. The other main character is Mabel. She is Dipper's twin sister. She is openly very weird and very silly, but she sort of decides to embrace silliness after thinking briefly that maybe she'll try to be serious. She's like, nope, I'm gonna be myself, which is great. She is pretty boy crazy. She goes through like 5 or 6 different crushes throughout the series. Very likely neurodivergent. The twins, all of the twins, could very easily be neurodivergent. Nothing is confirmed, but look at them. Going into the adults a little bit, you have Grunkle Stan, who was kicked out of his house at 17 or 18 and estranged from his family for most of his adult life. Not a ton else to say about him, but talking about queerness, it's relevant. Ford Pines always belongs in the queerness conversations. He was bullied as a child for something he couldn't control. He was born with 6 fingers on each hand. But based on that, he sort of develops this attraction towards weirdness as a concept. And he has this great line from Journal 3 where he is baffled by romance. But based on Ford's studies with weirdness, he develops this toxic/abusive partnership, friendship, relationship, whatever you want to call his interactions with Bill Cipher. Some people will read Ford's relationship with Bill as a relationship, with Ford being attracted to Bill, and this is corroborated by a lot of the things that come up to an extent in the show, but especially in the books. I have seen others read Ford as being on the aromantic asexual spectrum, and I equally love both of these takes because I'm aromantic asexual and I love this line, but it's also so interesting to explore Bill and Ford as a relationship. The other adult who makes this list, mostly based on the content in the Gravity Falls books, is Fiddleford McGucket, who leaves his wife and kid to spend all of his time with a guy who he is very close to, working on a project they both care about, and then gets traumatized by something on the project and uses a electricity-based tool to remove his memories of that time and that person, which has a little bit of a disturbing analogous concept if you're thinking about queerness. Now we can talk about everyone's favorite queer-coded villain. Bill Cipher is the epitome of weird. All of the things that I described about Hays Code queer-coded villains apply to Bill Cipher. And again, I don't think that's specifically trying to make Bill Cipher seem gay, except for in the books. But those are all things that are stereotypical of villains because of all of the reasons we discussed. The other villain worth talking about is Gideon, who is a creepy, 9-year-old psychic whose primary motivation is to get a 12-year-old to, what? Marry him? I don't know. Make her his queen? Instructions unclear. So weirdness as a concept in Gravity Falls is very interesting because there's a little bit of a dichotomy in how people talk about weirdness. Again, the supernatural stuff that happens in Gravity Falls is generally referred to as weirdness. There's also weirdness in the context of Dipper, Mabel, and Ford being weird as people. And then there's Bill. And everything about Bill is considered weirdness. We get into reclaiming weirdness a little bit in Gravity Falls. Like the first time that Ford meets Mabel, he says,
"I like this kid. She's weird."
So you get maybe 2 instances where the word weird is used in kind of a positive context, and then maybe 20 times where it's used in a negative context, by my count, which was not including every instance of the word weird, but there's definitely a tendency to consider weirdness bad in Gravity Falls. The entire apocalypse is called Weirdmageddon, and everything about Bill Cipher is weirdness as something to avoid. So now we're going to talk about queerness. And by queerness in this context, I'm generally referring to either gay relationships or stereotypes around them, or gender nonconformity and breaking of gender stereotypes. There's very little canon queer representation in Gravity Falls, which is to be expected because it was made in 2012. The only canon queer representation that you have in Gravity Falls is Blubs and Durland, who are originally conceived as goofy cop buddies, and in the final episode of the show they are confirmed to be in love.
We're mad with power and love.
So the main characters are able to sort of confront and reject gender stereotypes to an extent. I'm thinking about Dipper versus Manliness and the last Mabel Corn in particular, but the rest of the cast isn't really extended the same courtesy. And I am thinking about Grenda when I say that. Grenda is pretty much a caricature of a trans woman. There are moments in the series where she's able to kind of develop her own character and be a kind of aggressive and masculine woman and not have that played for comedy or played as a bad thing, but her gender nonconformity is used as a punchline quite a lot throughout the series. As much as it baffles me that we even have to discuss, Bodacious T is, for most of the series, is a very creepy, ugly man who then, during the apocalypse, finds a new identity by raiding the Hot Topic store, and is immediately told,
"No one will ever call you that."
And yet, at the end of the apocalypse, he keeps, I don't know, Bodacious T keeps that identity, post-apocalypse. So there's a lot to unpack there, and I don't think it was intended to be representation. I think it was intended to be a joke. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. As we've talked about, Bill Cipher has a lot going on with him in terms of the queer coding, and to what extent it's intentional, I don't know. So there's not really any comedy that comes from Bill's gender nonconformity or sort of queer-codedness. On the other hand, Gideon gets no shortage of flack for his gender presentation. There are so many jokes about Gideon being seen as Mabel's little sister and being less girly than usual when he's dressed in historical clothing, being pitched to the gnomes as their new queen. So there's a lot of sort of haha feminine boy bad going on with Gideon. So overall, in the original series of Gravity Falls, you have a pretty stereotypical portrayal of gender norms, and when the gender stereotypes are broken, it's often played for laughs. This isn't necessarily the intended messages. Like, I don't think Alex Hirsch and co. sat down and were like, hey, we want to tell kids that you should be following gender roles. It's just following a lot of the precedents of cartoons that have been going for decades. That being said, a kid could watch this and say, Weirdness can be good when it comes from people that I like, but it's kind of scary when it comes from someone I don't understand. So there's just a lot to think about when you're watching something that's made for kids that is relying on a lot of stereotypes and what is good and bad in society and what is normal versus funny and strange and weird. I want to stress once again, I love Gravity Falls. I think it is a fantastic show, and I have spent so much time in the past 6 months thinking about it. And there are parts of it that age a little bit strangely with what we understand about society now. And that's the point. It was made at a time when these were the precedents that were set by all of these previous cartoons, and in a lot of ways, Gravity Falls breaks boundaries for cartoons in the fact that it's sort of telling an overarching plot, and they're making a point to have things change between episodes to create that idea that we will be building on previous episodes, and everything with the codes and the Cipher hunt and everything is so cool and so groundbreaking for cartoons. But in other ways, there's a lot to be desired. So it's interesting to unpack. And now, let's talk about the Owl House. The Owl House was created by Dana Terrace, who was an animator on Gravity Falls, and Alex Hirsch went on to voice several characters in The Owl House. It aired between 2020 and 2023. It was meant to have a longer run than it did, and it is also the first Disney show to have an openly bisexual main character. So take that as you will. The premise of the Owl House is that the main character, Luce, is about to be sent to a summer camp to make her less weird, which we will discuss. And instead, she is pulled into this strange magical world called the Boiling Isles, and she meets a bunch of weirdos who help her kind of figure out who she is. So, Luce, Disney's first bisexual main character, clearly neurodivergent. I don't think she was technically intended to be, but in hindsight, Dana Terrace has said, yes, she definitely has ADHD, but we see her with well-represented attraction to both genders, which is great to see and kind of rare. At the very beginning of the series, Luce is about to be sent to a think inside the box reality check summer camp that is supposed to make her more normal and less weird. Again, there is a very clear queer analogy to that. But instead, being a human among a lot of witches who can naturally do magic, Luce sort of develops her own magic system using glyphs to be able to do things that she can't otherwise do, which is really cool. We also have Amity, who sort of begins as a little bit of a bully character. She really has about the same character arc as Pacifica from Gravity Falls, but she sort of moves into a more sympathetic role and decides to move away from her parents' expectations for her. And then she sort of evolves into the love interest for Luce, and she and Luce develop this lovely relationship. A couple more characters I want to introduce are Hunter, who is a child soldier and severely brainwashed for his entire life against what they call wild magic, but being another person who can't do magic naturally, he bonds with a palisman who allows him to use wild magic, and that sort of opens the door for him to unlearn a lot of the harmful things that he learned in his youth. I've also seen Hunter headcanoned as trans, with some of the evidence being his scene cutting his hair in season 3 and making his own clothes, as well as sort of being afraid to tell his friends that he's a Grimwalker, this sort of big secret part of your identity and your history. I could do a whole other video essay on Hunter. I will probably do several more animatics about Hunter, and I already have a song edit, so we'll leave him be. The last child that I want to talk about is V, and she is a basilisk and a shapeshifter. Shapeshifters very often have to do with queerness in some way, but she starts out hiding her identity by going to Luce's summer camp, and ends up creating an identity for herself in the human realm, and then doesn't really want to return to the demon realm, and ends up sort of having a found family in Luce's family in the human realm. There is an article on Nerdist.com that I'm going to be referencing a couple of times, and I will link it in the description, but one quote from that says that the found family is an integral part of the queer existence. And that's a big part of the Owl House. The main adult characters that I'm going to be talking about for the Owl House are Eda and Lilith. There's so much to discuss about Eda, but she is a character who is purposely very similar to Grunkle Stan. She's canonically his ex, which I find hilarious, but she breaks a lot of gender stereotypes, and she is the center of a lot of the found family on the Boiling Isles. She's a witch. We'll discuss witches in a little bit. She's very embracing of the weird. She's queer. She has a secret curse that she doesn't disclose to very many people, and that is often seen as analogous to a disability or a chronic illness that she treats with medication, which are the potions. Eda leans into a lot of the traditional witch stereotypes, which are heavily based on rejection of gender roles. Like a woman who is independent, who doesn't have children or doesn't have a partner, and who is outcast from society is more likely to be considered a witch. And that same article has a couple of wonderful quotes. Witches almost always get punished for daring to be themselves. This is sort of in line with the Hays Code villain, where if you're showing these sort of anti-society traits of being an independent woman and not having a family and all of these things, then the person has to be punished. And that's almost always what you see in media surrounding witches. This is what Belos is attempting to do with Eda for the entirety of season 1. He is saying she is an outcast, and she is different, and she is powerful as a woman and as a wild magic user, which is weird, and therefore we have to keep her contained and we have to destroy her, and he fails. The other fascinating thing that this article brings up is that the life of a witch often represents a queer person's dream life. And honestly, for Eda, yeah. Independence, love, found family, the resources needed to cope with your chronic illness, the ability to eventually make amends with your estranged biological family, working with your adopted kids to overthrow the genocidal overlord of your realm. Sign me up. Now let's talk about Lilith. Lilith is very brainwashed. She is unlearning a lot of harmful ideas throughout season 2, especially, as she leaves the covens behind and takes up the kind of life that Eda is living with wild magic. Lilith and Eda also both lose their magic at the end of season 1, which causes them to get involved with Luce's method of glyph magic. And then we have our villain, who is literally a Puritan witch hunter from the 1600s, whose goal is to destroy all magic and make the world the way it was in the 1600s. He cites religion in order to do this, and he is brainwashing everyone to see wild magic as evil and savage and wrong and sinful, which could not be possibly more different from the stereotypical Hays Code villain. So the first impression that you get of the Boiling Isles is, again, basically Weirdmageddon. Everything is somehow alive, and everything is, like, a little bit creepy. And Luce sees this and says, this is so much cooler than conversion therapy, than summer camp. Our impression of the Boiling Isles is, yeah, it is wild, and it is weird, and it is so confusing and a little bit scary. And that might still be better than being forced not to be yourself. In the very first episode, the first antagonistic location that we're introduced to is called the Conformatorium, which locks up anybody who is deemed weird. And then we immediately break out of that, literally, and we declare that
Us weirdos have to stick together,
which is the sort of the slogan of the series, and it places weirdos as a good thing. So the show centers characters, and especially young characters, who are carving their own talisman, who are carving their own paths in the world. And the forces that are stopping them from doing that are the ones that are portrayed as evil. In this context, this Weirdmageddon, like, creepy, weird, strange world is what you want to survive and what you want to protect. And so the big scary thing that happens at the end of the series is not, oh my goodness, the regular world might turn weird, but the weird world might turn normal. The show also centers characters unlearning all of these toxic ideas, like wild magic is bad, and everyone has to be in a box, and weirdness is bad, and religion is the only correct answer, and everything that society tells you is right. This is all sort of shut down by the end of the series in a way that absolutely would not have been allowed under the Hays Code. And the Hays Code has not been in effect since the 1960s, but it created all of these stereotypes and all of these tropes and precedents in cartoons that the Owl House breaks and turns on their head continuously throughout the entire series. In terms of queerness in the Owl House, it's everywhere, baby! Queerness is normalized and celebrated. Homophobia is never really portrayed. It doesn't really exist in the demon realm. And obviously there are times when you want to be confronting the existence of homophobia, but there are other times when it's really nice to see this weird, wacky, queer world and all of these weird queer people just being happy and having fun, and just having that not even be an issue. It's really refreshing. We see characters who use they, them pronouns, and it's never really discussed. You just meet them, and they use they, them, and it's never confronted. It's never an issue. You do see a coming out scene with Luce talking to Camila about the fact that she's bi in the intro of season 3, but otherwise it's just kind of a fact of life. People exist, and sometimes they're queer. Dana Terrace talks about her writing of the Lumity relationship of Luce and Amity, and she specifically didn't want the show to be a romance, and there's kind of a shockingly quick turnaround for the development of Lumity. Like, there are 12 episodes between Grom and Knock Knock Knockin' on Hootie's Door, and then it's sort of a fact of life, again, that after that, you have Luce and Amity just dating for the rest of the show. It's not like the final thing that happens in the big culminating moment. It's just, it happens. And it's natural, and it's awkward in exactly the way any other teen first romance is going to be awkward. And it's just really sweet and amazing. In addition to that really sweet first romance with the queer teens discovering themselves, you also see a rekindling of a relationship between queer adults, between Eda and Rain, which is really cool to see as well, because there's a lot of media surrounding queer teenagers finding themselves for the first time, and it's kind of cool to also see that if you didn't find your people when you were younger, it's never too late. There's always a chance to be happy and to be loved and to find your people at any point in your life. So there's now a new generation of kids and of teens who are watching The Owl House and thinking, this kid is weird, and her weirdness is what makes her awesome. Like, I want to be weird like Luz. So now we're back to our roots with my shirt that reminded me of Weirdmageddon, I guess, in color scheme. Now we're going to talk a little bit about censorship in Disney and about both of these creators in their attempts at sort of fighting the machine. Gravity Falls is kind of famous for fighting the Disney censors, and specifically there's a fantastic video that Alex Hirsch shared of emails between him and the Standards and Practices Department at Disney during the run of Gravity Falls. He managed to get an impressive amount through those censors, but Disney was a little bit of a stickler when it came to queerness. One of the things shared in that Standards and Practices email video is an interaction between S&P and Alex that goes like this.
Page 380. Please revise the action of Blub's putting his arm around Durland. As noted in previous concerns, their affectionate relationship should remain comical versus flirtatious.
Nope. They're buddies. Chill out.
Again, the intention behind Blubs and Durland was not to have them be a couple at the beginning, and then later, at the very, very, very end of the show, it was let through for them to be confirmed as a couple. And then there is the love god. And this one is so just bafflingly ridiculous, because the premise of this episode is that this matchmaker can make a match between anybody. Like, any humans, and between a snake and a badger. But we draw the line at lesbians. Alex Hirsch shared this in an interview when one of her storyboard artists presented the scene to me. She'd made one of the couples two lovable old ladies. It was sweet and casual, and I knew instantly that it was going to turn into a huge fight with Disney. So naturally, I left it in. The note came back immediately. The scene of the two old ladies kissing in the diner is not appropriate for our audience. Please revise. I responded with a one-word answer. Why? This basically broke the censors. They couldn't think of a single way to phrase an answer to that question, so they made me talk on the phone so there would be no paper trail. They were terrified of sounding like bigots, but I honestly don't think they were bigots. I think they were cowards. They basically admitted that there was no good reason why I should change it, but that they get complaints about this stuff from various homophobic parents and would rather avoid the headache, and couldn't I just drop it? After that huge back and forth, Disney eventually said, you have to cut the lesbian couple or we're cutting the scene. And so you'll notice Mabel spends the entire episode in this sweater. So Alex Hirsch really fought for this, and Disney said absolutely not. Fast forward to 2020, Dana Terrace got a lot of the same backlash and a lot of the same restrictions from Disney in early development of The Owl House. This is a tweet that she put out about this. In Dev, I was very open about my intention to put queer kids in the main cast. I'm a horrible liar, so sneaking it in would have been hard. When we were greenlit, I was told by certain Disney leadership that I could not represent any form of bi or gay relationship on the channel. And then another tweet says, I'm bi. I want to write a bi character, damn it. Luckily, my stubbornness paid off, and now I am very supported by current Disney leadership. So, Dana got it too. We did end up getting our openly queer representation in the Owl House. You will notice the Owl House is shorter than it was intended to be. Dana has said that that is not why it was canceled, but Disney did decide that the Owl House didn't fit their brand around the end of season 1, beginning of season 2. And I doubt that the decision was unrelated. Now, in the past couple of years, Alex Hirsch has talked a lot on Twitter about conversations he had with Disney and how much Disney has changed, how different the conversations are with the Owl House than they were with Gravity Falls. So he reposted this image and said, in 2012, the Disney censor note on this image would have been inappropriate for channel, please revise, call to discuss to avoid a paper trail. Now, in 2020, there's no note at all. Props where props are due. This time, Disney, you did good. On the same day, he posted, back when I made Gravity Falls, Disney forbade me from any explicit LGBTQ+ rep. Apparently, happiest place on earth meant straightest. But as of today, thanks to Dana, Terrace, and team, there are explicitly queer animated main characters on Disney TV. I'm so proud and happy to say that. There was a lot of fighting that went into both the queer representation that we did and didn't get from Gravity Falls and the Owl House. It is really, really cool to see how far that has come and how Alex Hirsch was able to be involved in a show that did better with that, and that Disney allowed to reach more of its full potential, even if it didn't get all the way there. I have absolutely loved getting to know both of these shows in the past year, especially as an adult. Honestly, I know that I would have been obsessed with both of these shows if I'd seen them as a kid, but it's really cool to see them as an adult and imagine what kids are getting now. It's so interesting to see each show as kind of a snapshot of the time when it was made, both embracing and rejecting the precedents that were set by the network. And I am unbelievably excited to see what comes next for both of these, because Gravity Falls just announced that it's getting a 300-page art book, which is wild. And Dana Terrace has had quite the month. She just announced a new The Owl House graphic novel, The Long-Lived King, which I am so excited about because it takes place between the end of the series and the 4-year time skip at the end of the series. And like within a couple of days of that announcement, her indie show, Knights of Guinevere, also got greenlit. And Knights of Guinevere, according to this awesome video by The Roundtable, is pioneering a new model of modern 2D animation that is supposed to both look better visually and give in-house animators more opportunities. So that's awesome, and I'm so excited to see what comes next for Dana. That is pretty much all I have. If you enjoyed this, I don't know if I'll necessarily make more cartoon video essays necessarily, but I do make a lot of cartoon related artwork and animatics, and I have been very excited about animatics lately, so there will probably be more of those, but I do have both a Gravity Falls animatic and an Owl House animatic, as well as a song edit for the Owl House. You can also find me on Instagram. That is it. Thank you for letting me babble for however long this video is about cartoons as an adult, and thanks for watching. Until next time.